The first time I ever saw anyone blowing into an iPhone, I sort of assumed that this was the new breathalyzer attachment. And I actually thought there were a lot of implications you could come up with for this, because I don't know about you, but I've drunk dialed once or twice in the past, and I think it might be a good idea to have a lockout, get the blood alcohol level below a certain thing. But this is, in fact, a musical instrument. In fact, this is a way that this inventor has managed to turn your iPhone into an ocarina. It has 4 holes, you blow into it, you make sounds, you can play it for appreciative or less appreciative audiences. But that's not actually what's all that exciting about it, although it is pretty cool. What's really exciting about it is that you can see all over the world who else is also making a fool out of themselves blowing into their iPhone. So you can go into the World Viewer part of this application, and you can look at a globe, and you'll see all over these little dots of light, which are people picking up the ocarina and playing it. And depending on who you are, you may think that this is sort of a cute thing, or you may actually think that this is pretty profound. And David Pogue, the other day, the technology critic for the New York Times, was making a case that this is actually a way that you can get a window into a much wider world. This is a key to looking at the global world of people who want to play the ocarina with you. So basically, you can look at this and you can imagine someone in Romania actually playing a real clay ocarina on the street. But I think you have to ask yourself a question. When you're doing this sort of imagination, an imagination of the wider world, are you imagining a world that's really out there, or are you engaging in sort of a fantasy world? Fiji water, by the way, actually shows up from Fiji. It's actually brought in containers. But what's interesting about it is that you can consume it as much as you possibly can until you run out of money at $2.50 a bottle, and never learn anything about Fiji or Fijian culture, or never actually connect with the Fijian. It's imaginary globalization. It's from another part of the globe, but it doesn't actually bring you any closer to the people there. So what I want to think about is whether these technologies actually bring us closer to people in other parts of the world. And as it happens, I have a little bit of experience with trying to get on airplanes and trying to figure out how to make connections based on music. And this largely has to do with the fact that I was a really lousy college student. And when I graduated from college, I did not have a lot of opportunities. I had an extremely lucrative philosophy degree, and you know how many openings there are in that field. And the one opportunity I managed to find was a chance to pretend to be an ethnomusicologist, fly off to Ghana, West Africa, and study neo-traditional music for a year. There was this really interesting phenomenon in Ghana, which was people making music that sounded like it had been written 200 years ago, but it was actually brand new. Now, I knew more about Ghana than perhaps anybody else who drank that much beer in college, but I basically knew nothing. And so my image of Ghana was basically that I was going to move to a city, Accra, 3 million people, very much like other friends were going to move to Boston or to New York. I was going to find an apartment, I was going to move in, and all of these illusions shattered as the airplane was coming down to land at Kotoka Airport. Because I looked out the window and I saw what I have to tell you is the scariest thing I've seen in my entire life, which was 1993, looking out at a city of 3 million people and seeing not one electric light. And in that moment, every preconception I had about what my life was going to look like was completely and utterly shattered. My apartment, needless to say, did not look a lot like the apartments that my friends were living in Boston and New York City. My neighborhood looked very, very little like those people's did, but that was not what bothered me. It was not the lack of water, it was not the lack of electricity. What was really hard for me was the fact that I couldn't get anyone to talk to me. Not in the sense that they wouldn't say, hey, O'Bruni, hey, white guy, how you doing? There was a lot of that. But there wasn't a lot of conversation that allowed me to figure out how people's lives were actually taking place. And finally, at a certain point, I cracked the code. And more to the point, I didn't crack the code. This guy cracked the code. This guy is Patrick Fiacci. And he was my landlord in Accra in 1993. And Patrick, like a lot of Ghanaians of his generation, was incredibly bright, incredibly smart, took the path towards education that he could get, which was in the Soviet Union, went to the university in the Soviet Union, oriented for the developing world, ended up defecting from the Soviet Union to the US, and ultimately became a cultural affairs counselor at a small university in the Midwest. Now, coming from a small university from Western Massachusetts, I sort of knew this guy, and he certainly knew me. And he was able to explain Ghana to me in terms that I actually understood. He would tell me that you never get angry, you laugh. And laughing is your way of sort of diffusing a confrontation rather than getting into a fight, because that never helps with anybody. And he would explain to me that no one on the street would ever tell me that they didn't know something. So if I asked for directions and said, do you know the way to so-and-so, the person will inevitably try to guide you there, even if the person's never heard of the place in their life. So you start learning these lessons, and pretty quickly you find yourself becoming accepted. But the ultimate acceptance came when I came to a local market, and no one there had ever spoken to me before, and people greeted me very politely this time. And I started coming back, and eventually I overheard someone say to the other in Chui, who's that crazy white dude? And someone said, oh, that's Uncle Pat's nephew. Now, I don't know about you, there's not a ton of family resemblance there, although, you know, I do think of him as my uncle and so on and so forth. But, you know, over time, what had happened was that Patrick had found a way to be a bridge figure for me. And when you're encountering other cultures, it's critical to find these people who are capable of being cultural bridges. Someone who understands enough of where you're coming from and enough of the culture that you're stepping into that you can embrace your xenophilia, you can embrace your desire to encounter something different and something strange and something unknown, but someone else is able to put it in terms that you understand. And if you have good enough bridge figures, eventually you find a way to fit in, and eventually you don't look quite as strange as you used to. Now, the truth is, people who end up having the experience of cultural bridging often become bridges themselves. You may remember this album. It was probably the biggest thing in the 1980s. Lots of you are nice, well-meaning New England liberals. Everybody has a copy of this. The way this album actually came about was that someone handed Paul Simon this album. And this was an album by a group called the Boyoyo Boys from Soweto. They had a really interesting and influential album, and Paul Simon just fell in love with this. And he went to his record company and said, I want to record with these guys. That was a real problem, because this was apartheid South Africa, and there was a cultural boycott going on. And when Paul Simon did, in fact, record with these guys, he actually was the subject of a UN resolution condemning him, briefly. They managed to pull it back eventually. But the only way that Simon was able to go to South Africa was actually this guy down in the lower right of your screen, a guy named Hilton Rosenthal, a South African guy who gave up an accounting career because he had the brilliant inspiration that it was crazy just to record white music or black music, and he ended up becoming the manager and the producer for a band called Jaluku, Johnny Clegg's band, which was the first major integrated band in South Africa. Rosenthal was the perfect bridge figure to be able to do this. He was perhaps the only white guy in South Africa who was going to be trusted by a group of Sowetan musicians who were able to then take a vote as the musicians union and conclude that if Paul Simon came there, South African music, and specifically Sowetan music, might become as big as something like reggae. And Paul Simon, to his great, great credit, actually then went out and for about 5 years toured around with groups like Ladysmith Black Mambazo. So basically, since someone had taken the time to bridge for him, he became the bridge between Sowetan music and American culture for a long period of time. Now, it's gotten a lot easier to be a bridge figure. If you decide to move to Ghana today, we can give you a lot of warnings. For one thing, you can go on Flickr and just get a sense for what's going on. There are great YouTube videos. There's all sorts of digital pictures of what's going on in the rest of the world. And you have absolutely no excuse to be as dumb as I was when that plane was landing. The thing is that despite having all of this infrastructure, we are still remarkably bad at predicting how other people are going to view the world and how they view things. And my example for this would be the Olympics. We've just gone through a period of taking a very, very close look at China on a giant global stage. China was understandably incredibly proud about hosting the Olympics, and the rest of the world was understandably interested to ask the question, what do we think about China? How do we feel about this? How do we feel about what we're doing? And people started talking back in one fashion or another, essentially saying, we have some real problems with China in terms of human rights. What's interesting is that not all of this talk was as respectful as this is. Some looked a little bit more like this. And you can understand when an image like this gets transmitted back to China, it resonates in the same way that a burning American flag does, or any other trampling of a national symbol. So there was a lot of pushback from Chinese bloggers who would look at photos like this. This was a very, very famous photo in the Chinese blogosphere. The photo on the left ran on CNN. And it shows a Chinese army bus coming into the streets of Lhasa. The photo is subtitled in such a way to essentially show the Chinese army's vicious crackdown on Lhasa rioters. The photo on the right was the original, as published on Agence France Presse. And on the right of it, there are groups of Tibetan rioters throwing rocks. And it's a very different photo, depending on how you crop it. And if you are a Chinese person, a nationalistic, proud Chinese person looking at this, this looks a whole lot like media bias from CNN. It looks even more like media bias when Jack Cafferty gets on his weekly show and refers to Chinese as the same bunch of goons and thugs as they've always been. This, in fact, went over so badly that people started a website, anti-CNN.com. There was a lawsuit. 2 Chinese people brought a lawsuit suing CNN for $1 billion, $1 for each offended Chinese person. This was a riot taking, not a riot, this was a protest taking place in LA, but there were protests that almost verged on riots within China. Now, Cafferty didn't realize he was speaking to a Chinese audience, but the interesting thing about the internet is that we're always speaking to every audience. We have an unseen audience at all the time. And in the same way that we have that opportunity to look online and get a picture of Ghana so that we can be slightly less dumb, Ghanaians are looking at our picture of them and trying to figure out how do we feel about it and how do we portray it. So things started getting very nasty and very difficult during the Olympics. And a friend of mine, Zhang Li, had a really interesting idea. He had a small group of people working together on a website called Yiyan. And the idea behind Yiyan was to translate media, English language media, into Chinese. And the idea was to give people in China a much clearer sense of what was going on in the dialogue in English language media. Now, what's particularly interesting about Yiyan is that it doesn't pay translators to do this. There are thousands of translators who get together, and they publish the Guardian newspaper every day. They translate a good chunk of the New York Times. They translate Time magazine. For those of you who read Mandarin, you'll see that most of those stories are China-focused stories. Really what this is about is getting a mirror of how your culture is being looked at in the rest of the world. But this has become incredibly popular in China. There's a group in Taiwan that's using volunteers to translate MIT's open courseware. There's a group called EcoTeam that translates The Economist magazine every week, the entire thing. I sat down and tried to figure out what it would cost to translate The Economist for a year using professional translators. That's well over $2 million. And they do it on a volunteer basis, and they do it because they're very interested in this question of how their country is viewed elsewhere. Now, let me say with some embarrassment, I don't know of any projects that are translating Chinese language media into English on the same scale. We don't have the same sort of volunteer effort. And we don't even have the same sort of group of people who are trying to get together and do it, although this is what I've largely been working on for the last couple of years. This is part of my team on a project called Global Voices. And Global Voices is a group of people who are bloggers. They're basically the folks sitting in the back of this room, not looking up from their laptops, but paying really good attention because they're there documenting everyday life, whether that's the conferences they go to or what they experience on the street. And what's interesting is that bloggers have a certain solidarity. They'll introduce themselves to each other as bloggers. They'll share stories about what they've had to blog. They'll talk about the tools that they use, and it turns out to be a certain amount of social glue. We have a group of volunteers. It's people from 120 different countries. And they get together and they produce a newswire. I mean, essentially, we publish somewhere between 20 and 60 stories every day from around the world, and we do this with almost no money going into the project. The vast majority of people working on it are doing it on a volunteer basis. And they're doing it for 2 reasons. They're doing it, first of all, because they're bridge figures. They want people to understand their culture. They want people to understand what the world really looks like from Fiji beyond the Fiji water. But they're also doing it because they feel a certain amount of solidarity. They are in this together. They've all got a common purpose and a common project. And that common project is something that turns out to be very, very powerful if you want to build ties across borders. This guy's Joey Ito. Some of you guys may know him. He's a very well-known venture capitalist. He's based in Japan, which is to say he's based on whatever airplane he's on at any given time. I think he currently has UAE citizenship. I never really know with him. The thing that we know about Joey is that he's almost always on the absolute bleeding edge of what's going on in technology. And for the last 2 years, the best place to see Joey was in World of Warcraft. because it's where he spent almost all of his time. You can see the resemblance, I think, between the two. That's his mage character. So Joey, for a couple of years, has been arguing that there's something really fascinating going on in World of Warcraft, and most of us have been coming back and saying, Joey, you really need to spend more time in the real world. But where I knew that Joey was actually onto something was when he started telling me stories about some of the dynamics within his guild. And it turns out that his guild has a cleric, and that cleric is a real-life Episcopal preacher who ends up being spiritual guide to a lot of the people who end up seeing him within this context. And it turns out that when one of the young people involved with this guild was faced with a major life decision, whether or not he was going to enlist in the US Army, knowing full well that he was going to go to Iraq, the first person he asked was Joey, because Joey was his squad leader. And this was an adult who had had his back, who had been taking care of him in a very real, very collaborative situation. They had a collective joint project. They had something that they were engaged with together. It didn't matter very much that you had an 18-year-old kid in the US and an incredibly wealthy, incredibly global venture capitalist. You had the common context of doing something together. So this is the problem that I'm trying to solve. I want more of this. I want more lasting friendships, lasting relationships, lasting collaborations that cross borders between different cultures, different language, different regions, different ways of looking at the world. And this takes me back to this question about the iPhone, which is this something that helps you connect across cultures? And the very simple answer to that is, if you're blowing it by yourself, it doesn't do much good. It's probably time to blow a duet. Thank you very much.